Yet another power grab. Welcome to Human Rights Week here on the Pandemic Podcast with me, Dan Astin-Gregory. Having witnessed one of the most unprecedented impacts on our civil liberties and our human rights over the course of the pandemic, in December 2021, the government issued a public consultation and announced plans to overhaul the Human Rights Act in the United Kingdom. And now some of our most basic rights are now at risk. So this week, in preparation for the closing date of the consultation on the 8th of March next week, we are bringing you a variety of content to help you to understand the proposed changes and what can be done to help protect our human rights in the UK. In this particular episode, we'll be covering the backgrounds of the Human Rights Act reform and unpacking some of the key issues, in addition to share how you can participate in the public consultation, which I mentioned is open until next week. So what about human rights in the United Kingdom? To give us a little flavour of United Kingdom's history, I thought I'd take a little walking tour of the UK's potted history with human rights, because the United Kingdom has had a long, proud and diverse history of freedom stretching back to the Magna Carta in 1215, and then in 1689, the Bill of Rights through to the 1918 Representation of the People Act. Then in 1998, the Human Rights Act passed and codified and protected our fundamental rights and freedoms and ensured that anyone, no matter their wealth or status, can uphold those rights in UK courts. The rights are enshrined within the Act and are at the core of the UK's identity as a democratic, or once democratic, fair and just nation. Those of us who have been paying close attention to what's happened in the last couple of years may believe that to have been seriously challenged. However, nonetheless, there are a number of key rights embedded in our culture and our legal system, and it's vital that these rights are not rolled back on or compromised, which is what the latest reform threatens to do. Now, to continue on our talk, the Magna Carta became the first document to establish a tradition of civil rights in Britain and led directly to the very first Bill of Rights in history, which Britain passed in 1689 and codified the civil and political rights of all men, not just the lords and barons of the time. This, of course, was a time where equal rights were not such a part of the equation. That came later down the track, which again is an important component of the Human Rights Act. Now, these initial documents ingrained a strong tradition of civil liberties in Britain, and so much so that it was never considered necessary for the UK to have a formal written constitution. However, when the Human Rights Act passed through the Houses of Parliament in 1998, it was described as a historic day for rights in Great Britain. And the Human Rights Act codifies and protects fundamental rights and freedoms and ensures no individual, no matter what their wealth or status, can have their rights compromised. And each individual has the right to uphold their rights in the UK court system. These rights are enshrined in the Act and are key. They include the right to life, which protects your life by law, the prohibition from torture and inhuman treatment, the protection against slavery and forced labour, the right to liberty and freedom, the right to a fair trial and no punishment without law, respect for privacy and family life and the right to marry, freedom of thought, religion and belief, free speech and peaceful protest, no discrimination, the protection of property, the right to an education and the right to free elections. These rights are embedded in our culture and the legal system, although, again, as I mentioned, there are some worrying signs in the past couple of years. We have in the UK a careful balance of power in place for a reason. It's to make sure that when governments get things wrong, as they inevitably do, again, as we've witnessed clearly over the last couple of years, we have a way of holding them to account. This balance ensures that the power is held in check and that nobody is above the law. But in recent years, we've seen that this is under threat. And right now, the government is looking to overhaul the Human Rights Act. And this has been a long-held ambition for some of those in power over the years. And whilst the language in this reform is about making amendments, we should be under no illusion. Under this reform, some of our most basic rights are at risk. This is, after all, a government intent on making rules that that do not apply to us, but only to them. In fact, they're rewriting the rules so only they can ever win when it comes to the rights when it comes to court. So the government wants to replace the Human Rights Act with a Bill of Rights that would dramatically weaken our ability to hold the government and authorities to account, and weakens our ability to defend ourselves when the state violates our rights. Once again, as we've seen over the past couple of years, interesting timing. So where did all this begin? Well, the process began with the establishment of the Independent Human Rights Act Review, which was announced in December 2020. It was set up by the UK Ministry of Justice as an independent panel, and the panel considered options for amending the Human Rights Act and invited views in a call for evidence in a similar way to as we're seeing now with the latest consultation. However, it examined the relationship between the courts and the European Court of Human Rights, as well as the relationship between the UK courts, the executive, and the Parliament. And the panel's first report was published back in December 2021. Now, at the same time that this took place, the Independent Human Rights Act Review that we've just talked about in the report that was published, the Parliament's own Joint Committee on Human Rights had a parallel inquiry, taking evidence on a much wider set of questions to understand just how the Human Rights Act has been working, where the fact it does need to change. And the Joint Committee on Human Rights published a report back in June 2021, which said the evidence was heard and led to us to conclude that there is no case for changing the Human Rights Act. So the Joint Committee for Human Rights quite clearly stipulated ahead of the publishing the Independent Human Rights Act Review that there was no case for changing the Human Rights Act. However, on the 5th of October 2021, Dominic Raab stated that he would overhaul the Human Rights Act, despite the fact that the Independent Human Rights Act Review report would not be published till later on in the year, in December. So this meant that the public and organizations were unable to see and scrutinize the report recommended to the government before the government published its own plans with this reform. This led to the government issuing its own public notice of the consultation on the 14th of December, where the Human Rights Act is now being presented for reform under this new consultation. Now, why is this problematic? Is this another example of mission creep? Well, yes, it seems to be so. The government's consultation goes much further than the independent review's original remit and recommendations. And while some of the proposals may appear similar to the original report, many others represent drastic changes. In fact, Sir Peter Goss, QC, the former appeal judge who led a government commission review of the Human Rights Act, told MPs that he does not consider the government's consultation on reforming the 1988 legislation in any way reflects the nature of his report. He told the House of Commons Justice Select Committee that the original report and government consultation simply do not work together. Now, Amnesty International, Liberty Human Rights, and other human rights organizations have condemned the proposals. Liberty's director, Martha Spurrier, has said that this plan to reform the human rights is a blatant, unashamed power grab from a government that wants to put themselves above the law. They are quite literally rewriting the rules in their favor so they become untouchable. She went on to say that this reform is a threat to how and when we can challenge those in power, including stripping some people's rights away and requiring everyone to get permission from a judge before they can take the state to court. Now, whatever you think of this government, they must respect the rule of the law. This change will mean that governments of all political leanings will be beyond the reach of public accountability. Martha Spurrier went on to say that this proposal is being cast as strengthening our rights. Well, in fact, this plan, if it goes through, our rights will be fatally weakened. This government is systematically shutting down all avenues of accountability through a succession of Rust bills, and we must ensure the government changes its course as a matter of urgency before we find very quickly that our fundamental rights have gone. Now, there are a number of specific concerns that have been laid out, and we only have time to today's episode to cover a number of those initial concerns. We'll be covering these in further detail over the course of the week. But number one, the first concern is reiterated by the concern raised by the Joint Committee for Human Rights. In this instance, that there is no need for a Bill of Rights to replace the Human Rights Act. Over 2 decades in its operation, the Human Rights Act has played a fundamental and significant role in giving individuals the power to enforce their rights in practice. It has enabled people to challenge unlawful policies, to be treated with dignity by public authorities, and to secure justice for their loved ones. The supposed case for change set out in Chapter 3 of the consultation is nothing of the sort. It provides a sensationalist and slanted understanding of the operation of the human rights in the UK and disregards the positive impact of the Human Rights Act and sets up, wait for it, division amongst the people who are deserving of human rights and those who are not. The proposals, if passed, would enforce this division, further divide and conquer amongst the UK. Everyone will lose out if this Bill of Rights is to become law, but certain groups would be more negatively affected than others. And it is only the government and public authorities who stand to gain at the cost of us all. Number 2, the independent panel tasked with the independent review worked for 9 months to produce a 580-page report on how to fulfill the 2019 Conservative Manifesto commitment to update the Act. Now, whilst the report in itself is far from perfect, the consultation document largely ignores this report, far exceeding, as we've discussed, the terms of reference within that report and soliciting views on proposals that were explicitly rejected by the Independent Human Rights Act review and ignoring specific recommendations, such as a program of human rights education in schools and universities. The Independent Human Rights Act review found no justification for the overhaul now on the table. Number 3, the Human Rights Act was introduced less than 25 years ago in order to bring rights home and enable individuals to enforce their rights in the UK. These proposals that are on the table today both weaken those rights and make enforcing them more difficult. A Bill of Rights that weakens human rights protections in the UK is a very poor replacement for the Human Rights Act. Now, at the same time as undertaking this consultation, it's clear that the government is yet indeed taking a further power grab through multiple oppressive bills that are currently making their way through Parliament, including the Police, Crime and Sentencing in Courts Bill, which will shut down the right to protest, extinguish a protected way of life for certain communities, the Elections Bill, which will make it harder to make our voices heard at the ballot box by introducing voter ID, the Judicial Review and Courts Bill, which will erode access to justice, and the Nationality and Borders Bill, which will fundamentally undermine the asylum system and renege on the UK's international obligations. Now, within this proposal, the government is rewriting the rules in order to make itself untouchable. And we'll be expanding, as I mentioned, on some of these very specific issues within our episode on Thursday with Louise May Creffield from Save Our Rights, who will give an in-depth overview of what she believes are the top 8 issues that she has elicited from the reform proposals. Now, in closing, democratic governments protect the right to protest, to vote, to challenge power, and above all, they fight to protect our human rights. We deserve and we must demand a government that acts in our best interests and not in the interests of itself. We must ensure the government changes course as a matter of urgency before we quickly find ourselves wondering where our fundamental human rights have gone. So it's time to join the consultation. Now, I will concede, compared to other previous consultations, this one is a little bit more complex, it's a little bit more detailed, and it's a little bit more nuanced. Now, the good news is we'll be putting together some resources to help you to complete the consultation so you can join the campaign this week. But in the meantime, you can use Amnesty International's fantastic guide, which you can find at amnesty.org.uk/HRA-consultation. We'll make sure the link's there on the screen for you. We'll put the link in the comments. You can also use Save Our Rights template, what they put together to email the consultation, which you can go to saveourrights.uk/human-rights. Now, these 2 resources will give you some template guidance on how to complete the consultation, which you can do in one of 2 ways. You can either complete the form or online, go through each question piece by piece. You don't have to give responses to every question. In fact, the Amnesty International guide just gives you responses to the key questions. Or you can email the allocated email for the consultation, and the Save Our Rights resource will give you a template for doing that. So again, that's the Amnesty Guide, which you can go to amnesty.org.uk/HRA-consultation, and the Save Our Rights template at saveourrights.uk/human-rights. These two resources will help you to complete the consultation. But to help you further, as I mentioned, there'll be further resources that we're putting forward this week on the Pandemic Podcast. But as a starter for 10, please do share this episode to help raise awareness of the key issues here that we've outlined today. Many people aren't aware that the Human Rights Act is being reformed, and many, more importantly, aren't aware of the consequences of such. Now, many of us have felt the full force of the government in the last 2 years, and we've seen them grab powers, we've seen them pull out statutory instruments overnight. It's important now as we move forward from the pandemic to protect our rights and liberties, which is why it's really important that each of us plays a role in challenging this Human Rights Act reform. And as I mentioned, you can do so by joining the consultation. And we'll be back further this week. We'll be covering a debate on Wednesday night that the Together organization are putting through. We'll also bring you Louise May Creffield on Thursday. And on Friday, we'll be giving a recap of the issues. And finally, next Monday, ahead of the consultation, we'll be giving a final push to make sure we can get the consultation filled out appropriately. And we do hope over the course of the week to bring you comment from Amnesty International, Liberty, Big Brother Watch, and some of the other human rights organizations involved in this campaign. But firstly, please do share this episode. Let's raise awareness of the issues that are out there. And lastly, if you have not done so already, please just take a moment to subscribe to our mailing list, which you can do at danjgregory.com/pandemic to make sure you keep up to date with all of our content and our campaigns. And you can also join our private community where we are building a counterculture movement to restore and protect our freedoms and rights, not only in the UK, but around the world. And you can visit weareelevate.org to join us there. Thank you very much for watching this episode. It's down to us to protect our rights, and it's the power we have to change is in our hands. So take action today, share this video, and please do join us in completing this human rights consultation. Thank you for watching this. I've been Dan Astin-Gregory. This is the Pandemic Podcast. I'll see you in our next episode later this week. Good night for now. Peace.